Hello everyone, I'm Joey from Lock Props, and today I'm going to be showing you how I made the sheath for my Sandai Kitetsu. Now this is going to be part 2. Part 1 is actually how I made the sword and painted everything, but I would recommend that you check that video out after you watch this one fully, so then that way you don't kill my watch time.
You just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
But today we're going to be focusing on this part right here. So all of the tools, materials, and my Etsy blueprint are going to be down in the description below. Those are going to be affiliate links, so they help me out greatly if you use them, so thank you so much. This may potentially be one of my longest videos that I have on my channel, so be sure to buckle in. Let's get started. I'm going to start off by grabbing the sword that I made in the previous video and grabbing some 10mm EVA foam. I'll take my Sharpie and trace along the blade. When I'm tracing, I'm giving myself some extra length here because I want to make sure that the sheath isn't going to be so small that it can't fit. Then I'll use the width of the Sharpie head to trace along the line that I just made. Next, I grabbed my metal calipers and measured it out to 10mm. Reason why I did this is because the blade is made out of two 5mm EVA foam strips, and then we're dealing with 10mm EVA foam, so we need to make sure that we accommodate for that. When I use the metal calipers, they'll make a little indent in the foam, so then that way I don't have to use a Sharpie for this. I can just see the line and be able to cut it with my razor blade. Speaking of razor blade, I cut everything out after I traced it with the caliper. On the 10mm EVA foam, we're going to set the calipers to 10mm. That way we're bringing out a 10x10 EVA foam strip. After I make my mark with the calipers, I cut it out with my razor blade. Next, I took some barge contact cement and I put 2 layers on the areas between the line and then the edge of the foam. Then on the strips of foam we made, I put 2 layers on each side. Once the contact cement was tacky, I began laying it down, trying to make sure that I lined up the edges. Once I got one wall on one side, I put the sword into the sheath so then that way I can see how much room I have. Then I noticed that I had a lot extra on one side, so then that way I can go ahead and cut down now. So for this, I ended up cutting off roughly around 6 to 8mm in foam. After I had cut off the excess, I grabbed the 10mm strip and put it up against the sword so then that way I can see that it looked like it still fit. But there could have been more that I cut off, so I went one more pass at it. After I saw that it can fit my sword, I went ahead and put 2 layers of contact cement in the area where we're going to glue down. Doing another test fit and we're good. You'll have some excess at the end, but that's okay because then we're going to cut it down to what it needs to be. I'm going to put some contact cement down on the walls and on the other side of the sheath. I place down paper towels on one side of the sheath. That way I can control the one side that I'm going to be gluing on. Then when I'm ready to do the other side, I'll slowly take one paper towel out at a time. Be sure to press down on the edges so then that way it covers all the holes. I always like to do a lot of test fittings whenever I make anything final. Now we can start trimming it down. I grabbed my razor blade and I started cutting off the excess foam that were protruding from the sides. For this next part, there are multiple ways that you can go about it. You can go at it with a rotary tool, you can go at it with a belt sander like I normally do, or you can even just use sandpaper if you really have the time. But I will always prefer the rotary tool or the belt sander over just hand sanding. If you have a rotary tool, I would recommend a lower grit so that way you can shape it down a lot faster. I would probably guess that if you are going to be doing this with a rotary tool, this is at least going to take a couple of hours to really sand it down and get it all even. Because with the belt sander, it took me roughly around 45 minutes to get this all rounded down. My biggest recommendation is to go slow and be patient with it. If you go too fast, you might make a mistake and then you may potentially have to start all over again, and I don't want to see that happen. Since this sheath is extra thick with the walls, it's a lot better for me to sand everything down and get it into that oval shape. If it was any thinner, I would have protruded into the sheath itself. Now we can cut off the excess from the sheath. I put my blade into the sheath and then I made sure that where I was cutting, the blade wasn't going to be, but I would make a cut, then put my fingers into the sheath, and if I don't feel the sword, then I know I can cut a little bit more. And I just kept going until I felt like it was a good place to stop. Just be careful, because this could be the moment where you could ruin the sheath and the sword at the same time. To make everything all even, I grabbed 240 grit sandpaper and put it on my orbital sander and began sanding all the way around. If you don't have an orbital sander, I would probably recommend just getting 240 grit sandpaper and hand sand until it's even. Since I sanded down the surface, I grabbed my heat gun and I heat sealed the foam. The next part is going to be for the details of the sheath, so now you can go ahead and take your template and cut it out. I'll grab my digital calipers and I'll measure the detail that's at the top of the sheath. I measured about 12 millimeters. I took a piece of 2mm EVA foam and made one side straight. If you don't have calipers, you can use your ruler to mark 12 millimeters going all the way down the edge, and then you can cut a straight line. But since I have the calipers, I set it to 12 millimeters and then made my mark all the way down. I put the ruler on the line and then I made my cut. And it matches. Using the foam that I cut out, I used the Sharpie to mark where I'm going to be putting the barge cement. I took a long piece of blue masking tape inside out, so then that way I can place the foam on top, so then that way when I glue it, it doesn't move around on me. I did 2 layers of contact cement on the strip and 2 layers on the sheath. After about 5 minutes, I started gluing them together. I had some excess with some overlapping, so I looked where it overlapped and I made my cut there. There's a small seam line, but that's okay. If we use some clay foam and some water, we can clean that up. I used my rotary tool to clean it up a little bit. We're going to go back to the template where this detail is. I set my calipers to that thickness, which is about an inch or around 25 millimeters. Grabbing more of that 2mm EVA foam, I made my mark for the strip. I grabbed my ruler and then I cut out 2 of these. Now we'll go ahead and place the template next to the sheath, so then that way we can know where to put our markings are where we're going to be putting contact cement on. I put the strips that I cut out onto the inverted masking tape, and then I began putting on the 2 layers of contact cement. Also do the sheath. After semi-dry, we'll go ahead and place it onto the sheath. Now, whenever I know that there's going to be a seam line somewhere, I'll try and put it underneath or on the bottom. Once we wrap it around, we'll have that overlap and then we'll make our cut. Then we grab that mixture of the Cosplay foam and the water to fill those seam lines. Had to get out some more 2mm EVA foam. I used my heat gun to start flattening it out. This really thin detail I wanted to have raised, so I set my caliper to 3mm. I made my mark into the foam, used my ruler, and then I cut it out. Since you're going to be in the middle of cutting multiple ones, I would say cut as many as you like, just so then that way you have extra. But I ended up only using 5. For gluing the small detail on, I'm going to be using super glue. I sprayed some accelerant onto the sheath itself and then put some super glue onto the small strip. I put the super glue on the beginning part so then that way it adhered immediately, and then that way it wouldn't just unravel. Then I lined the rest of the way with more super glue. You can be patient and wait for it to dry or cure, but I am not patient at all, so I used the accelerator. Then we keep doing this until both sections on both sides are done. Next, I'll do the same thing with each side, and I'll have a strip of foam go all the way around into the middle. Taking one of those strips, we're now going to go ahead and create the X in the pattern. So I'll take one of the strips and I'll cut at a diagonal. I'd say probably 45 degrees. I'll add some super glue into the middle just to keep it there, and then I'll use the accelerator to keep it in place. Then at the end, I'll cut a diagonal so then that way it sits flush with the border. This part is going to be tedious, so just take your time with it. We'll put some super glue into the area where we're going to be making the second part of the X. I made a diagonal cut that matched the slant in the foam there, and then I glued it down. Then I do the same on the other side, making sure that the foam lines up as best I can. This part was probably the most tedious of the entire build, so I would say if you're going to do this, take your time with it and take breaks. Because not only do you have to do this twice on each side, but then it's technically you're doing this 8 times in total. So I said earlier, cut out about 5 of these things. I would say cut out maybe 8 or 9, just so you have extra. And also when I made these strips, I made them at the full length of the EVA foam. You remember how I said I got impatient? So I ended up using barged contact cement for the other side. To be honest, I feel like I didn't really notice that big of a difference once it was all said and done. So you can go either way. Contact cement or super glue, whatever you prefer. But I do feel like that the contact cement was a bit faster. It just will leave a little bit of a texture in between the detail. But it actually might be good because I feel like that with the Rub and Buff Gold, it actually added a lot more detail to it. For the little seam lines that I did see, I grabbed the Cosplay foam and filled them. Next, we're going to work on the end of the sheath. So we're going to go ahead and cut out this piece from the template. I'm going to take some more of that 10mm EVA foam and I'll trace this on there, front and back. For the inside detail, I used my X-Acto blade to cut along the Sharpie line. Then I used my rotary tool to clean it up. I'll take my template onto the sheath where it's going to go and I make my marking on both sides. I add contact cement in the areas where I'm going to be gluing this down. But I totally forgot about the details, so I need to cut that out of the template now. Use the X-Acto blade and go ahead and cut out this detail. Now that we have our stencil, we can go ahead and lay it right on top of our foam and then trace it out. Then I put the barge onto the pieces that's not going to be seen. I left all that excess foam on there because for the next part we need to be able to cover up this section right here. The gap in the middle I measured 32mm. So taking that 10mm EVA foam, I set my calipers to 32mm and then I traced it along the edge. Since I saw the line pretty clearly, I just followed it with my razor. I placed a strip onto the inverted tape and then applied 2 coats of contact cement. I'm thinking about just saying barge from now on. I don't know if you guys prefer for me to just say contact cement. Anyway, let me know in the comments. What do you think? Then I carefully lined up the edge of the strip to the detail piece and I began wrapping it around on the inside. The excess that was on the other side, I cut it out and made it flush. Since it's at an angle, make sure that you cut at the same angle. Now that we have that middle piece in, we can start cutting off the excess foam. Yeesh, that's rough. But that's okay, we're going to clean it up. If you have a rotary tool, I recommend using the lower grit, the more harsh drum first, and then switch over to a higher, softer drum. Start sanding in a forward motion. Never ever drag the rotary tool towards you, always away. If you bring it in towards you, you'll actually gouge the foam and you'll leave this big old dent in the side. I've made that mistake so many times when I first started. But for the sake of time, I went ahead and just took it to my belt sander and sanded it down pretty quickly. The most important thing is that you're knocking down the edges to make it round. Forgot about the detail. We'll take the template and we'll put it on 2mm EVA foam, and then we'll trace it with a Sharpie. I didn't want to put this piece on first because I felt like that it was going to sand it down and then you wouldn't see the detail at all. We'll cut out the details with the X-Acto blade, then put 2 layers of barge on the back of them. Going over to the sheath, I went ahead and put 2 more layers onto that too on both sides. I forgot, we have to trim out the top part of the detail. So do this before barging. Once they were kind of dry, I set them on both sides. I know, kind of looks a little weird, but when we start sanding it down with the belt sander, it kind of just all blends in with each other. Now that the main bulk of the sanding was done, now we can go to 220 grit sandpaper and begin shaping it down to make it all even. Then I switched over to 800 grit. Using my heat gun, I'll apply a light heat wave to seal the foam. Then I applied another layer of Cosplay foam and water, so then that way the end is all evened out. And a bit smoother. Next, I'll take the sheath outside and spray 3 layers of Plasti Dip on it. With the Plasti Dip, I did heat it up in some warm water for about 5 minutes. Warm water, not boiling. Next, I'll grab some frog tape and I'll start taping up the areas that are not going to be red. To make it easier for the paint to adhere, I grabbed some of this basic white and I did some light coating onto the sheath. Because going from black to red is going to take so many coats. I would have used Createx white, but I didn't have it. For painting of the sheath, you can do it in any way that you want. You can paint on the acrylic, you can also spray paint it red. Honestly, it's just because I want to get better at airbrushing that I'm using that. So I'll be mixing together Createx High Gloss, their Crimson Red, and their Gloss Black. I also added in some of the reducer so then that way it can easily come out of the airbrush. So I kept adding in some black until I got to the color that I liked. Then I put it in my airbrush and began painting it. Now we have to paint in those lines. You can either do it by hand, but for something like this, I want to see if I can make it uniform. Luckily, the masking tape that I have from Frog Tape is exactly the width that I need. So I basically used that as my template. So I took a strip of the masking tape and I wrapped it all the way around the sheath. Now that there is a definitive line there, I need to now make a little bit of space for the black line, and then I'll wrap another strip of the masking tape. Honestly, for this, I just kind of eyeballed it. As long as if it looks even going all the way around and it's straight, then it should be okay. But I did eventually measure the thickness for those lines, and I did about 4 or 5 millimeters. Next, I'm going to do another mixture of the Gloss Black and the High Gloss mixture. Shook it up until it was thoroughly mixed, put it in my airbrush, and then I sprayed it on. Luckily this time around I didn't really have to clean up too much. The tape actually held in the lines really well. Next I just went down the line, so I butted the tape right up against the black line, and then I did the exact same thing again. I recommend that if you're trying to keep it as straight as possible, sometimes you might need to pull the tape really hard and keep it straight, so then that way it falls into line and where you want it to go. And you might be thinking, why didn't you just continue doing that so then that way you do all the lines at the same time? Well, the problem is that the second one that I end up doing, because I'm pulling it and I'm contorting it, the other line is going to be completely uneven. So for that, I'm just doing it one at a time. So now enjoy a montage of me painting the rest of the lines. Ah, just like Christmas. We can now take off the tape for everything else. For the gold parts, we're going to be using Gold Leaf Rub and Buff. First, I went up to this top area and I just applied layer after layer until it was completely filled in gold. Next, I did this section right here with the X's. You can fill this entire part in gold, but make sure that you keep the middle blank space in between the two details black. Then we'll do the end of the sheath. Is that a pommel? I don't think it's a pommel. It's a pommel's on a sword, but on the sheath, I'm like, I don't know what section that is. It's just the detail at the end. Now there was one of the lines that I did need to clean up, so I took the same mixture that I did for the red and I grabbed my brush and then I applied a light layer over it. Cleaned it up pretty well. Since I had the brush and the paint out, I went over some of the areas that needed a little bit more of a touch-up. Grab my roll of 2mm foam again. I measured the width of the straps that are on the sword handle, which was about 3 to 4 millimeters. I put my calipers to that length. I made the mark across the edge and I cut them out. For this, I would probably recommend cutting out at least 10 of them. Took it outside and then I sprayed 3 layers of Plasti Dip. Once dried, I need to make a mixture again. So I grabbed some of the red that I already made, but then I added some more black into it to make it darker. This way I can try and match it the best I can with the handle that I had already made. Then using my airbrush, I applied multiple layers onto the straps. Since the mixture had a gloss in it, I needed to have it matte because the handle of the sword is matte. So then I grabbed this matte coating and then I sprayed that on. Now we can start wrapping the sheath. So I grabbed the first strip, I'll cut at an angle, and then I'll glue it down into the top area and then start wrapping it all the way down to the bottom until I get to the end. Then I'll cut with the X-Acto blade at the same angle that it is touching the bottom, and then I glue it down. Then I'm going to repeat this process going in different directions, putting it in different areas that there wasn't any strapping before. So then that way it's really just kind of all over the place, and that way it doesn't have a set pattern to it. I am really excited how this turned out. I am so excited to get started on the next blade though, which is going to be Zoro's third current sword, which is Enma. Now, once that video goes live, I'm gonna go ahead and put it right here for you, so then that way you can watch it now. It's right there. Go ahead. I dare you.